Under the high red bricks of St. Marien, silence fell where a funeral bell should have spoken. Greta caught the falling hemp before it touched the wet church floor. The broken bell rope still swung above her, shaking dust that smelled of old wood and salt. Around the coffin, mourners froze with their mouths half open. No one had heard St. Marien fall silent in the middle of a funeral. The dead man's brother still knelt beside the bier. His hands gripped the black cloth so hard that his knuckles shone pale. Above him, the great bell hung quiet in the brick throat of the tower, and the severed rope brushed the stones like a loose tail. Father Anselm came down from the chancel steps with his face set hard. "Greta Hinz," he said, and all heads turned toward her because everyone in Wismar knew whose hands made the strongest harbor lines. "Can you braid a new rope before Sunday?" She looked at the snapped end. The fibers had gone dry and powdery with age. She smelled mold, lamp smoke, wet wool, and beneath it all the tar scent that never left her own sleeves. Her husband had taught her to judge rope by touch, not sight. He had been dead 5 winters, taken with his crew when the Marta Else failed to return from Visby, yet her fingers still searched for his in every coil. Before Sunday, the priest said again, the bell must speak for the town. Greta should have refused. A bell rope for St. Marien was not harbor work. It had to bear weight, but it also had to answer many hands: priest, sexton, watchman, gravedigger. It had to move like a backbone through prayer, warning, and mourning. Yet the churchwarden stood helpless beside the coffin, and the dead man's mother had begun to cry without sound, her shoulders shaking under a dark shawl. Greta bowed once. "Bring me the old measure," she said, "and keep the tower locked until I come." By the time the funeral ended with spoken psalms instead of tolling bronze, the news had crossed the market. Before Greta reached her yard, 3 widows had already crossed themselves at her gate. A bell rope was being made, and the town had begun to wait for its voice. The chest under the bench. Greta's workshop faced an alley where the wind pushed fish scales and straw against the wall. Inside, coils of hemp hung from pegs, and the floor kept the smell of tar, ash, and rain. She barred the door, laid the old bell rope on the bench, and measured its thickness with both hands spread wide. She drew strength from a chest that still smelled of pitch and winter salt. Then she crouched and pulled out the sea chest she had not opened since her husband's last voyage. The iron latch stuck. When it gave, the lid lifted with a dry sigh, and the smell struck her first: pitch, salt, and the faint sharpness of old cedar. On top lay a cap with the brim cracked white from dried spray. Beneath it rested 3 lengths of cord her husband had cut for practice, smooth from his palm and dark with tar. Greta sat back on her heels. For a moment she held one strand against her cheek like a measure of cold weather. Her breath shook once, then steadied. "If your hands cannot finish it," she said into the still room, "mine will." She began to hackle the fresh hemp, drawing it through the iron teeth until the fibers ran long and clean. She twisted with her thigh, her palms, and the wooden hooks mounted to the post. The first cords tightened well, though her wrists soon burned. By midday she had built the rope's living core. But near dusk she stopped. It looked strong. It did not look like a rope that belonged to St. Marien. The bell of a town did not call only ships and graves. It held names no ledger could keep. Greta wrapped her shawl close and went out again. She crossed Wismar while shutters thudded in the wind. At the cooper's house, a blue sleeve still hung behind the door, left there by a son who had died of fever in spring. At the baker's, a child's mitten lay on the bench beside the oven, untouched though flour had settled over it for months. At the harbor storehouse, an old pilot kept his brother's sea cloak folded in a chest and opened it each market day to air the salt from it, though no salt ever left. Greta asked for nothing. She watched, spoke a few plain words, and waited until each household turned away for a cup, a key, or a candle. Then, where a hem had frayed or a cuff had loosened, she drew one small thread free. No cloth changed shape beneath her fingers. No one noticed. She took from garments that already belonged more to memory than to use. At the widow Marta's house, she paused beside a little pair of shoes set under a stool. Marta saw her looking and placed one hand over the shoes at once. Greta did not move closer. She only said, "I came for lamp oil." Marta nodded, though both women knew Greta had no jar. The lie stood between them like a blanket held up against the wind. When Greta reached home, she laid the gathered threads in a row: blue wool, brown linen, black felt, one faded red from a soldier's coat returned without the man inside it. They looked thin as breath. Yet each had lived against a body once. All night she fed them into the lay of the rope, hiding them between the stronger strands. The new cord thickened under her hands, pale hemp turning with darker veins through it. Each time she tucked in another thread, she named the absent person under her breath, not as a spell, but as a worker marks lengths and counts turns. Near dawn, she added her husband's tarred cord to the center. The rope gave one hard twist, as if it had found the grain it wanted from the start. The noon that broke open. On Sunday, the sexton hauled the new rope up the tower while Greta climbed behind him with her jaw set tight. The stairs wound through brick and dust. At each landing she heard the town below, gulls over the harbor, cartwheels on damp stone, a dog barking near the fish market. When they reached the bell frame, the bronze mouth hung over them like a dark moon. One stroke of bronze opened doors that had stayed shut for years. They fixed the rope to the wheel and tested the pull. It ran smooth, no catching, no fray, no weakness at the splice. Father Anselm touched the cord once, then gave Greta a grave nod and stepped back. The first full toll rolled out over Wismar at midday. Greta felt it in her ribs before she heard its shape. The note did not strike clean and fade. It bent, it deepened, it passed through the tower floor and down her legs like harbor surf under planks. The sexton looked up, startled, and crossed himself. In the square below, people stopped where they stood. A woman carrying onions set down her basket and pressed both hands to her mouth. Across the street, the cooper leaned against his own door as if someone inside had called his name. At the baker's window, old Barrett stared at the bench by the oven and began wiping it with her apron, though nothing lay on it but flour. Greta hurried down from the tower. By the time she reached the nave, the church had filled again, though no service had been called. People entered with the stunned faces of sleepers dragged from bed. One man spoke first. When the bell sounded, he said, "I saw my brother's boots by the quay. Right where he left them before the storm." A woman near the font shook her head. "I heard my daughter cough in the loft. Not the coughing itself. The pause after it. The pause when I knew she would not mend." Others answered at once, crowding over one another. A mother had heard the scrape of a stool and remembered the instant her son's place at table turned empty. A smith smelled burnt wool and knew again the hour his youngest came home carrying a soldier's belt with no man attached to it. Each account struck from a different corner of the town, yet all landed at the same point, the moment hope changed shape. Father Anselm raised both hands for quiet. It took time. Some wept with open faces. Some stood stiff with anger, as if grief had walked into church without knocking. Then Counselor Teed rounded on Greta. His fur collar shook with the force of his voice. "What have you put in that rope?" The knave turned toward her. Greta's palms still held hemp dust. She rubbed them against her apron and said nothing. She could not tell whether the bell had taken her hidden threads and made memory from them, or whether memory had always waited in the town, packed tight as wool in a chest, ready for the first hand that lifted the lid. That evening no one rang St. Marien for vespers, yet the town heard the noon toll again in cups set down too hard, in doors left ajar, in faces lifted toward empty stairways. Wismar did not sleep early, but it grew quiet before dark. Night in the brick tower. By the next day, Wismar had divided into whispers and sharp voices. Some said the bell had become a mercy, because many had carried their dead like sealed jars and now the lids had cracked. Others said the rope was wicked work and must be cut down before it pulled sorrow through every lane. In the tower, truth stood between them like a drawn cord. Greta heard both sides before noon. A fishwife seized her wrist at the market and kissed her knuckles with tears in her eyes. An hour later, the counselor's servant spat on the ground near Greta's shoes and told her the council would question her at dusk. She went first to the houses she had visited. She did not confess. She only watched. At Marta's home, the little shoes still stood under the stool, but now Marta had cleaned them and set a sprig of rosemary beside them. At the Coopers, the blue sleeve had been mended and folded away into a chest instead of left hanging by the door. At the Pilots, the sea cloak was spread across a bench while two brothers sat near it in silence, their shoulders no longer turned from each other. Not every house found peace. In one lane, a man smashed a bowl because the bell had brought back his father's last look and he had no place to set his anger. In another, an old woman barred her shutters though the day was clear, unwilling to hear even a sparrow strike the sill. Greta carried those faces with her like stones in her apron. At dusk she climbed the tower alone. The stairs smelled of lime, bat droppings, and cold brick. Below, the town lamps pricked the streets one by one. Above, the bell waited with its mouth turned toward the harbor. Father Anselm stood in the belfry before she reached the top. He had no lantern. Pale light from the clouded sky laid the lines of his face bare. "I know you did something," he said. Greta rested one hand on the rope. It felt warmer than the air. "I drew threads from garments kept for the missing," she answered. "Only one from each, in my husband's cord at the center." The priest closed his eyes for a breath. "Why?" She looked through the louver toward the dark water. "Because the town had grown skilled at circling its grief. People bowed in church, traded in the market, salted fish, stitched cuffs, and left one chair empty in each room. They lived, but they would not touch what had torn. And now they must. Now they can hear it." Father Anselm placed his hand over hers on the rope, the brief touch of one worker meeting another. "Sound can open," he said. "It can also wound." Greta nodded. That was the cost standing before her in timber and bronze. She had reached into houses without leave. She had made a cord from private sorrow and given it public force. Her skill had crossed a line her trade had never asked her to cross. Below them, a horn blew from the harbor, short and urgent. Another answered, then another. Greta stepped to the louver. On the black water she saw lanterns jerking low and fast. The wind had shifted north. A gale was driving straight into the roadstead, and 3 coastal boats were still outside the harbor marks. Father Anselm turned to the rope. "The watch bell." Greta did not move aside. "If we ring it now, they will hear more than warning." He looked at her. "Then let them hear both." When the gale reached the harbor, Greta took the rope in both hands and pulled. Under spray and bell stroke, the town chose each other over silence. The bell answered at once. Bronze struck air with a force that shook dust from the beams. The sound rushed across the roofs, over chimneys and warehouse gables, and out toward the harbor mouth where the black water reared under the wind. Below, doors flew open. Men ran with boathooks, lines, and lanterns. Women lifted cloaks over their heads and herded children from the quay wall. Apprentices stumbled from lofts half-buttoned and barefoot. The watchmen shouted for sand, poles, and spare rope. Wismar moved as one body under the bell's command. Yet each person carried another sound within the warning. Councillor Teed reached the square and stopped dead for one beat, hearing again the hour he opened his son's chest from the war and found only a knife, a salter, and a shirt split at the shoulder. Barrett the baker gripped a basket of bandages and saw the midden on her bench before she kept running. Marta bent to pick up a dropped lantern, and in that bent shape Greta recognized the old motion of a mother lifting a child who no longer weighed anything at all. The bell did not spare them. It gave them their own wound in the harbor at the same time. Greta kept pulling until Father Anselm and the sexton took turns with her. Her shoulders flamed. Hemp burned her palms raw through the skin she had hardened over years. On the 7th toll, she heard her own hour at last, not the day the Marta else failed to return, but the afternoon she stopped waiting at the pier before dusk. The gulls had cried over empty water. She had turned home carrying her husband's cap beneath her apron, and with that turn she had known the sea would keep him. The knowledge hit her so hard that her knees nearly failed. She leaned her forehead against the rope for one breath, tasting salt on her lip that might have been sweat, might have been tears. Then she pulled again. At the harbor, the first boat struck the outer posts and slewed broadside. A line flew from shore. 2 men missed it. On the 3rd cast, Councillor Teed caught the wet rope under one arm and wrapped it round a bollard while others braced their heels in the mud. Barrett bound a sailor's split scalp with flour sackcloth. Marta held a lantern low over the stones so rescuers could see where to plant their feet. All across the quay, hands worked under wind and spray. No one stood aside to protect private sorrow. The bell had dragged each person back to a room, a bench, a pier, a threshold where absence first took shape. Now that same bell held them facing outward. By midnight the boats were in. One mast had snapped. 2 sailors had broken bones. No one was lost. The gale spent itself against the warehouses and moved inland. Water dripped from every beam of the harbor sheds. People stood wrapped in blankets, shivering, watching the dark settle into ordinary night again. At dawn the council met in the churchyard. Greta came with bandaged hands. She told them what she had done before anyone asked. She named no household. She bowed her head and said she would cut down the rope herself if the town wished it. Councillor Teed looked at the strips around her palms, then at the harbor beyond the graves. His face had changed in the night. Grief had not left it, but pride had loosened its hold. "No," he said, "leave it." Father Anselm added, "The bell will not be rung for idle hour marks. Only for prayer, burial, warning, and need." No one argued. Years later, People still said street. Marien's bell sounded unlike any other on the Baltic coast. Strangers heard bronze and wind. Wismar heard more. When the rope moved, a house might pause over a bowl, a shoe, a cuff, a cap left on a peg. Then the hand in that house reached for the next task, and reached with less fear. Greta kept making harbor lines, tow ropes, and net cords. She never again took thread from another person's cloth. But when the watchman needed the bell in storm weather, he asked for her if she was able. She would climb the tower, lay her scarred hands on the cord, and pull until the town answered.